On page 13 in your Theater Appreciation textbook are requirements for different types of drama. Let's start with the requirements of traditional Greek tragedy. Keep in mind that this is a traditional Greek tragedy. A modern tragedy might have slightly different requirements. A traditional Greek tragedy must contain a serious subject and have a protagonist of heroic proportions. The protagonist should be a great figure who represents more than one individual. Traditional Greek tragedies are similar to fables in that there is always a lesson to be learned. Since the protagonist represents a larger group of people, the lesson is applicable to a larger group of people. In a traditional Greek tragedy, everything must happen in an honest and straightforward fashion without the element of chance. Once events are set in motion, they must continue forward to their logical conclusion. As an audience member, we fear that what is happening to the protagonist might one day happen to us. Also, in a traditional Greek tragedy, the protagonist must be defeated. But from this defeat, a lesson is learned. Modern tragedy, for instance, All My Sons, doesn't have to have a protagonist of heroic proportions. Depending on how you analyze it, either Joe or Chris are generally considered the protagonist, and neither of them are of heroic proportion, although an audience could certainly side with or put themselves in the place of either one of those characters. The next type of drama is melodrama, and it also must have a serious subject. But that is pretty much where the similarity to Greek tragedy ends. In a melodrama, the characters are more broadly created. Therefore, they are easy for the audience to recognize. There are good guys and bad guys, sidekicks, innocents, and other such stock characters. In melodrama, the elements of chance and coincidence are almost always an essential part of the protagonist's struggle. While the protagonist almost always wins, there is very little learned by their winning. And even when they lose, nothing is usually learned. If anything comes to mind when someone says melodrama to a modern audience, it is usually the type of story I used to help describe the terms in the last lesson. It is the Dudley Do-Right, Penelope Pureheart, and Snidely Whiplash kind of story. However, there is a much more common type of melodrama on today's TV, and that is Law and Order. On SVU, for instance, there are the stock characters of the two detectives, a tough woman detective and a hot-headed male detective. There's also the stock characters of the captain and the coroner and everyone else in the department. These are the types of people we see in nearly every police show. In most Law and Orders, the case is solved by some chance piece of evidence being discovered late in the story. Normally in Law and Order, the good guys win, and even though they frequently try to make some lesson out of these episodes, the lesson is not very deep. Almost every cop show, hospital show, and law show on TV is a melodrama. Unlike Greek tragedy and melodrama, comedy treats its subject matter in a much lighter vein. Even when the subject matter is serious, the treatment is not. But comedy in the classical sense is supposed to provoke thoughtful laughter. Today, most movies that we think of as comedies are not comedies in this classical sense. They don't try to provoke thoughtful laughter. They are written and acted in a far broader way and more closely resemble farce than comedy, although Hollywood sells them as comedies. We will get to farce in a moment. In a traditional comedy, the events are possible and probable. In other words, what happens is what we think probably should happen. In a traditional comedy, the plot grows out of the characters, not the situation. Some time must be given to the development of the characters so that the audience can understand the characters' points of view and therefore understand the plot. We can contrast this with situation comedy or sitcoms, as they're called on TV, where the comedy is normally based upon very stock two-dimensional characters in odd situations. Again, like TV melodramas, the characters in many sitcoms are the same in every other sitcom. What's different is the situation. You have the young handsome guy and his funny-looking friend, and the beautiful girl and her funny-looking friend, and perhaps the mean grandfather and the odd father. These characters show up in nearly every sitcom, or in a lot of them, but in different situations. So finally, in a traditional comedy, the story is an honest portrayal of life. This goes back to the idea of what's supposed to happen happens. There are subgenres of comedy. We have 3 of them listed in the book. Black comedy is making fun of something that really isn't funny. For instance, Fight Club has us laughing at fighting, which isn't really funny. Pulp Fiction has us laughing at, for instance, someone having their head blown off in the back seat of a car on accident. If we think about it for even a second, this isn't funny, but the movie made it funny. Another subgenre of comedy is parody. Monty Python's The Holy Grail is a parody of the King Arthur legend. Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein is a parody of Frankenstein novels and films. And there's also the subgenre called satire. Satire ridicules human behavior or societal behavior. On stage, Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest makes fun of the British class system and the upper classes. There are many political satires: Wag the Dog, Bob Roberts, and Bulworth. And the recent film The Candidate comes to mind. Now, I haven't seen the latter, and though I doubt it is pure satire, I'm sure the element of satire is used. And finally, there is farce. The goal of a farce is simply and purely riotous laughter or escape. What happens in a farce is possible, but not very probable. So during the expositional portion at the beginning of a farce, the audience learns what kind of strange universe the characters exist in, and the audience then expects them to behave correctly for that universe. For instance, in many farces, characters are extremely gullible and impressionable. If someone makes a suggestion to them, they simply believe the suggestion. So long as the audience recognizes this characteristic and accepts it as a characteristic of the universe of the play, and the characters remain true to this characteristic, it appears lifelike. Lifelike, that is, so long as the play moves very rapidly. If the characters have any opportunity to stop and think about how they are behaving, it would be unbelievable for an audience to accept that they would indeed behave that way. And if the audience has any time to sit back and think about how the characters are behaving, it also becomes wholly unbelievable. Finally, and unlike a traditional comedy, a farce relies heavily on situation, not on characters.